皆さんお待たせいたしました。
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for waiting. Let us start the third session from 9:30 in the morning. And we are continuing into the afternoon and into the evening, and thank you for bearing with us for the full day. And please do remain until the very end. Session 3 will take up the subject of future perspectives of renewable energy. 3 speakers will come up to the podium, and we will look at the policy. First session looked on the renewable energy policy perspectives, and the second the market. And third, we would like to look forward to what is the future of renewable energy. And we would like to discuss this question. And already, as you can see, the 3 speakers have been activists in the non-governmental organizations around the world. And also, this would mean they belong to non-business, you could say, organizations. So in the 21st century, I think we do need the push from the NGOs, the non-government organizations from around the world. And I look forward to hearing from these 3 speakers. First, I'd like to call upon Dr. Eric Martineau, who is at ICEP, Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies. He's been teaching the world over, in Beijing as well. And so, Eric, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm going to give you some very brief points from the Renewables Global Futures Report. It's a brand new product by REN21 and the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies, ICEP, jointly. Christine Linz earlier today referenced this, and it's a sister report to the Renewables Global Status Report, which actually I've written as the lead author for the last 7 years. And that report on the status of renewable energy that Christine presented to you earlier has nothing in it about the future. So we got this idea to, okay, we really need to focus now on what does the future look like. And the purpose of the report is really to say, what is our current thinking about the future of renewable energy? What is the range of credible possibility for that future? And it's really a tool for discussion, for education, a way to think about the future, not a specific position, but really an objective way to think about the future. What are people saying about the future? What is the status of the future, if you will? I spent several months traveling around the world interviewing people, asking for their opinions and their views about the future, experts, industry people, policymakers, academics, a wide range of people. We ended up interviewing about 150 people total, and also collected many of the published scenarios that that have come out in recent years, recent 2 or 3 years, looking at what the scenarios say about the future. So I'm going to share a few points of this. It's still being developed. If you're interested in a copy, I can send you a copy of the draft if you'd like to review or read it, and I'll give you some few overview. First, just looking at total energy share. How much energy from renewables in the future? We've heard a little bit about that today. Maybe the most prominent example is Sweden right now. They're getting half of all of their energy from renewable energy today. Many other countries have 20% shares or more. Austria, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, New Zealand, and Portugal. Germany and several others are at 10%. And Japan is currently at 6% share from renewables. The scenarios point to much higher shares in the future. Several scenarios published in the recent couple of years show 50 to 100% in the long term. And we're actually going to hear from Sven Teske and from Yamagishi-san from WWF on these scenarios. International Energy Agency projects 40% as one of their scenarios by 2050. Greenpeace is projecting up to 80%, and we'll hear about that. The European Commission just issued a roadmap last year saying that renewables could reach as high as 75% in Europe by 2050. Interviewees, when I talk to people, they all believe that these high numbers were possible. 30 to 50% at least. Many believed we should reach 100% or get close to 100%. If electricity is the easiest, most people think that it's pretty easy, actually relatively straightforward to get to high shares from electricity. Heating is much more difficult, and transport, there's quite a bit of uncertainty still about transport from renewable energy. And I'm just going to cover those three topics right now: electricity, heating, and transport, and then conclude with remarks about integration and transformation. So electric power, how much electric power from renewables? Well, countries today are already receiving high shares. Spain, over 20%. Germany, 14% on average, electricity from renewables now. And very high goals. California is targeting 33% by 2020, and Germany is targeting 50% by 2030. We saw those German goals and targets earlier when Martin Schoppe presented. And if you look at the scenarios, and this is a list of some of the scenarios that we've looked at, you see quite high electricity shares, over 50% in most of these cases. The electricity side of this is actually, I think, fairly straightforward in terms of achieving large shares from renewables in the future. And of course, the WWF scenario goes up to 100% by 2050. The lowest, the World Energy Outlook, the new policy scenario, 32% by 2035. You can see the range of scenarios we have. How to reach these shares, how to get there. So this was really the interesting part of the interviews, the interesting part of scenarios, this project, is how do we get to high shares of electric power? And there are really four issues which I'll highlight today: balancing of power grids. And utilities will respond, and they will balance power grids. This is not going to be a serious problem. They can do it. They're doing it now. There are a dozen different ways in which utilities can balance variable renewables like wind and solar on power grids. And utilities are already doing these today, and they'll do more of them in the future. One of the most important is the demand response, so varying customer loads as necessary to balance grids. And this quote here, flexibility in power systems. In the future, flexibility in power systems to adjust loads, to adjust various forms of supply is the commodity of the future, meaning that's what's going to get traded, that's what's going to be bought and sold. You're going to need power plants with flexibility. Number two, energy storage. Okay, we don't need to wait for energy storage to become commercial. We can balance grids today without energy storage. There are commercial forms emerging today, however. Some companies are making money in installing storage and selling it a storage service to the utility. So that's happening, and this quote here, there's a lot of headroom with other balancing options before storage becomes necessary. Natural gas, also very key to balancing renewables on grid. And the future will see integrated renewables and gas solutions, companies, business models, policy, infrastructure integration of renewables and gas in many different ways. Distributed power, power systems will evolve to have distributed, decentralized components on-site and remote both. There'll be a balance, local microgrids, small wind farms, biomass power plants, all many forms of distributed power will come in. Power systems will become multi-level, and this was pointed to over and over again, both scenarios and interviews, this sort of broadening of power systems from one centralized level to many levels leading down to individual homes. Okay, now let me turn to heating and cooling. How much from renewables? Well, modern biomass today gives us about 2.5% of global energy in the form of heat. So biomass is a significant contribution to heating today. Solar hot water, we have 185 gigawatts of solar hot water, and that's roughly equivalent to, I guess that's about half of Japan's total power capacity, a little less, but of course it's thermal capacity. But 185 gigawatts is rather a large number. If you look at the scenarios and what they're projecting for heat, you can see numbers ranging from 16% up to 85, 90%, again, from the Greenpeace and the WWF scenario. So a wide range, a divergence of ideas about how much we can really get from renewables for heat. And it's interesting to sort of think about what goes into these numbers, why they're so low or so high. So how do you get there for heating and cooling? Policy is very important. We see city governments, we see local governments around the world implementing new policies to promote heating. For example, the city of Copenhagen is going to require, is planning to have 98% of all of its district heating from biomass. The city of Hamburg enacted a renewable energy law that requires new buildings to use renewable energy for a share of heating. There's an EU directive that's going to take effect in 2018, 2020, requiring also near zero energy buildings. So once you have a very low energy consumption building, a near zero energy building, it's much easier to supply that building with 100% renewable heating if the heat demand is very low. So this trend towards near zero energy buildings, these so-called passive houses or passive buildings with almost no energy consumption for heating, is very important for renewables. You can see a range of technologies for heating as well: geothermal heat pumps, biomass pellets, small-scale biomass, combined heat and power, solar heating, solar water collectors, solar heating collectors for very large buildings, not just for homes, but for commercial buildings, for industry, for process heat. Many people looked at the possibilities of solar heating on much larger scales, more efficient, cheaper when you do it on a much larger scale. Heat storage, also very important. If you can store heat from one day to the next, or even from summer into winter, and you can store the summer heat that you get from your solar collector and use it in the winter time, new phase change materials that allow you to store heat for long periods of time. People are expecting to see advances in those phase change materials. And of course, solar electricity can reduce air conditioning load, and that's part of the heating side. Third, transport. How much renewables? Again, a wide divergence of ideas about transport, from 8% in the IEA scenario to 100% in the WWF scenario. Right now, biofuels supplies about 3% of transport. If you look at how we get there, how we employ renewables in transport, it really breaks down to three things: advanced biofuels. And the World Energy Outlook from the IEA says we may see advanced biofuels become commercial by 2020, and projects that they could achieve some share, 8% of transport. There's a lot of debates about biofuels, how sustainable they can become, what markets make the most sense to use the biomass, whether it's biofuels or something else, how long to commercialize, cellulose to ethanol. Electric vehicles assume a much larger transport role, but won't necessarily help renewables immediately. Much longer term, they will. They'll be able to provide storage to balance variable renewables. But for the time being, we're not going to deploy electric vehicles to manage the variability of renewables in the short term. And there were questions about whether electric vehicles would ultimately be battery or fuel cell, hydrogen or battery electric recharge. And that battery electric might fulfill specific niches like small vehicles, fleet vehicles like taxis, and also micro vehicles, 1 or 2 person vehicles, very small ones, but emerge as a niche. Synthetic natural gas as well, same thing. There's actually Audi, the car maker Audi, is planning to produce synthetic natural gas from renewables and produce as much synthetic gas to serve the natural gas vehicles that it's planning to sell. So we could see the emergence of these markets for synthetic natural gas used in vehicles. It's a very interesting development. Okay, so two topics I want to finish with. One is integration and the other is transformation. So we're seeing from these interviews, from these scenarios, people are talking about integration of renewable energy into infrastructure, into natural gas. Denmark is integrating renewables into heat supply, combined heat and power plants, so that if you need to store the electricity, you can do that by lowering the output of heat and power plants and using stored heat instead of the power plant itself. And you can use the heating plants to balance the electricity side, and you have an integrated system, electricity and heating. And this is what they see in Denmark. All sorts of innovative ideas for vehicle to grid, using electric vehicles ultimately to balance power grids. making synthetic natural gas or hydrogen from renewables, passive buildings I've mentioned, on-site solar to reduce air conditioning load. All of these things are ways that renewable energy gets integrated into our existing infrastructure, both in homes, in houses, in transport, and in power systems. Also integrating renewables into business models. So companies will integrate renewables into business models. They'll create new businesses. Major engineering companies are integrating renewables into their total engineering solutions. Just a part of that. Local energy service companies may integrate renewables into their business, and we see NTT facilities here in Japan is doing that on some level, including ICT and software, third-party owned PV. And then finally, policy integration. Policy integration, renewables get integrated into not just environmental policy, not just energy policy, but transport planning, certainly power market regulation, but also transport planning, urban planning, smart cities, building codes and standards, district heating, water, food, sanitation policy even, in terms of how you might have biorefineries produce both energy and food from biomass, and the way that comes about. My final topic, is transformation, and this was also a big theme in the research. Solar PV is approaching grid parity. We're reaching the point where solar PV is competitive with retail electricity prices, and we're going to see continuing this grid parity spreading around the world, and we're seeing it soon come to places like Spain, Germany, US, Hawaii, and California. Transformational policies, new targets and goals for the future, new policies related to power market integration, and we'll talk about that tomorrow morning in this conference, how to establish power markets that have a price on flexibility. How can policy support demand response? What's the policy role for transmission planning? And how to encourage efficient integration of gas and renewables. Transformational business models, lots of examples. I won't go into that, I'm out of time, but some really interesting new business models coming along, transforming business. So we're seeing transformation of the use of solar PV. We're seeing transformation in terms of policy making and also in terms of business models. And just leave you with this idea that it's really interesting what's happening. This is one of my favorite quotes here. Electric utility companies will face some of the greatest challenges in technical and institutional restructuring that they have ever faced in the past 100 years. Utility revenue models will be unrecognizable beyond 2020. These really point to coming huge transformations. And there will be fights. You can't avoid them. The transformation, one person said, the dying throes of the centralized fossil fuel and nuclear industries, it's going to get ugly, maybe at least in some places. I'm not sure how that will play out here in Japan. Anyway, I hope I've given you some flavor for the report. Again, as I said, if you're interested, I can send you a copy of the draft for your review. And I just want to close by saying that I think we can get to predominantly renewable energy world in the future, and I plan on working until that happens. I'm not going to retire until we get there, so thank you.
Eric はまだ若いから
Eric, you're very young, so you have many, many years till retirement. So thank you. So we were able to get the whole picture of what the renewable energy's future is. And of course, how much is important, but the how part, I think, is an area that I have great interest in. For example, the technology and business model to implement renewable energy is important, but we need a change in society, in mindset to support that. It may be that we need to have regulations. It needs to be that society side also acknowledges the change in the usage of energy, and society needs to be prepared for that as well. And so compared to Japan and other advanced renewable energy areas, I think the way of coping with the situation is different. Any comments to that, Eric? The way Japan and other countries cope with difficulties?
Well, I would say that primarily around the world, if you look at where renewables have developed, it's because of policy support. You look to Europe, you see feed-in tariffs. You look to the US, you see portfolio standards and tax credits. And you look around the world, and we heard about that also earlier today in the Global Status Report, that it's really policies which are driving renewables. And I think that that's very important here in Japan, that Japan is sort of on the edge of perhaps enacting stronger policies and strategies for supporting renewables. We have the feed-in tariff enacted in September, which is really historic. Okay, we can think of China as well. China, maybe not so much in terms of policy, but they have very strong targets. So they're setting very, very ambitious targets for the future, and then they're carrying out those targets, and they are enacting policies that help them to do it as well. But sort of thinking about future levels to get to, and then both incentives and in terms of government support for achieving those targets. Short answer.
Thank you, Eric. では次は、グリーンピースのですね、スベン・テスケさん。
So we'd like to invite Mr. Sven Teske from Greenpeace. So I was talking with Sven a while ago, and within Germany, Greenpeace is highly recognized in the society, maybe compared to police and financial institution. There's a lot of credibility toward Greenpeace. And in Japan, when you hear about Greenpeace, we always think of the whales. And it is at times that they're playing the bad role. But 3 million supporters are the global supporters. And in euro, 230 million euro is the amount of money that is used. So it's a huge entity, and we're very, very pleased to have Mr. Sven Teske to give his views, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to jump straight in our Energy Revolution report. The Energy Revolution scenario series is in place since 2005, where we published the first time a European scenario. A global scenario has been published the first time in 2007. And since then, 3 editions have been published, and always more expanded the database and the amount of results we have. We go into job effects now, and many other things, and we always have different parameters for different audiences, and I'm coming to that in a minute. But before we predict the future, or we try to sort of propose a specific pathway in order to save the climate, reduce CO2 emissions, and also avoid nuclear accidents by shutting down nuclear power plants and avoiding nuclear waste, we need to have an idea of the past. And this is a graph about the annual new power plant market worldwide since 1970, so around 40 years. And you see that there was a fair equal mix. That's large hydropower, this is gas, this is coal, and this is nuclear. And the average market was always around 85,000 to 85 to 90,000 megawatts. This has changed in 2000. So basically 2 things have changed in 2000. One is that the market for power plants went up quite significantly, and that's due to the fact that the industrialized countries need to repower, so the old power plants are old and need to be replaced by new ones, and the developing countries increase their power demand and need new power plants. But you also see that the liberalization took place in the US and in Europe around the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s, the first effect was no new power plants have been built in Europe and in the US for the first 5 years. And then it took off, and it basically, mainly gas took off. And then also renewables took off. First wind, and now solar PV is coming. So that's a very fortunate development. And just have a look on the slide right now. You see also a lot of coal. And now you will see the same graph without China. And you see that the majority of coal, new coal in the last few years, was built in China, but also the majority of wind, or half of the wind, was built in China. So that's a very rapid development. You also see that gas is dominating. So now we had a quick look on the past, and in our computer model we use, we also have in our computer model a replacement, which means our model knows, so to say, when to replace power plants. So after 30 years of lifetime for nuclear, after 40 years of lifetime for coal, and after 20 years, for example, for wind, we have to build a new one. So this is in the model embedded. And that would mean that our projection for the next 40 years would be that there is still some coal and gas until 2015, because we also take into account all the power plants under construction and having a permit. That's quite unrealistic to say that they won't be built. But then a real drastic reduction, and then solar, wind, and all the other different renewable energies will come into the market. This is what we need in order to prevent temperature increase above +2 degrees. And also, a scenario is a scenario. It's not a prediction. This is what we would like to see if we have good policy. And in our scenarios, we try to make a good prediction for the next 5 years, and then we have a good estimate for the next 10 years, and all the rest is basically a projection what we want to see under certain policies. We are particularly proud of our publications with the wind industry, because we published those scenarios in cooperation with AREC, with the European Renewable Energy Council, and also with the Global Wind Energy Council. We have joint publication, and we look back what we published in '98 for the wind market in 2010. We were right on the spot, ±10%, and that was quite clear. So hopefully we are good or lucky, or maybe call it a mix of both, good and lucky, to be right for the next 40 years. This is what Japan has done in the past. And this is still a question mark. What will be 2011 and forward? We have done and published last year, there's a typo I just saw, published the energy revolution scenario for Japan. We basically have a lot of scenarios. We have more than 40 country scenarios for 40 countries around the world, and we have, of course, the global one, which is calculated by the German Space Agency. This is our partner, so we have a scientific partner, the German Space Agency. We have a local partner on the science base, which is ICEP in this case, for the scenario. We have the industry, because we would like to check if what we have in our scenario, if they could actually deliver. It would be extremely embarrassing if we have a very ambitious, let's say, wind scenario, and then the wind industry would get back to us and say, well, that looks nice, but we can't deliver that in this time frame. So that's important. And then we have our local offices. We have offices in almost 50 countries who know the local policy. So what we basically have drawn is the efficiency concept is from Tetsu, from ICEP. That's basically one of our input. Then we have power generation. We need a faster uptake of renewables, of course, especially solar and wind, due to their very short construction times. And in the short term, we increase the capacity factor of existing gas power plants, and also later on we use them as a backup for gas, for wind and solar, and then later on we implement storage. We do not implement in our concepts very fast storage because of costs, and also we see that's not necessary for the next years to come. And we need to increase the wind market from 220 megawatts in 2010 up to 5,000 megawatts between 2012, which means this year, and 2015, and then increase it even further. So looking back, we published it in September. This hasn't happened yet, but we are really hopeful that the feed-in law will come and will then do the job. This has been done. This has been basically done as well. Efficiency is also one, and one thing which is usually very seldom for our strategies. Usually we are right on track with our scenarios on the renewable side, but not on the nuclear phase-out side. But for the Japanese scenario, we are on track with the nuclear phase-out, but not with the renewable side, which is also new to us. So this is basically how the replacement strategy for the entire fleet. That means first it's a lot of gas, then it's wind, and solar kicks in later, and efficiency. So this is the overall capacity we need for this scenario. And we don't have time to go into details, but we are basically, the problem is that the uptake of solar and wind did not take place yet. So this is what we need on the annual market. So 5,000 megawatt wind for the next years, 5,000 megawatt PV for the next years, and those are capacity factors and so on, which I won't go into detail. But how do we achieve that in our scenario? I will just skip those. Now, before I come to that, I would like to also show you the result of job effects, because in many discussions around the world, we get accused that we are anti-development and anti-jobs. This is not the case. First, Greenpeace in Germany actually has its own utility with 120,000 customers. I'm still a board member of that. You're not earning a lot of money with it, but it works, plus minus. So you can actually do that. And that also helps us to work on our concepts, because we do this in practice on a very small scale, of course, but we do this. So job creation, it's a very important factor, and I'm happy that I can show this slide, because Mr. Schöpe from the German Ministry of Environment wasn't able to show the same slide because he ran out of time, so we can show it now. So we calculated around 260,000 jobs for our sort of basic energy revolution scenario, and the advanced one, which is more sort of the more on the upper level, even 326,000. If you compare that to the current jobs in Germany, that fits quite well. So basically, Germany and Japan have been compared this day quite often. And in terms of the market size for the uptake of our concept, that would result in our calculation in roughly the same amount of jobs. So that sounds about right. In terms of the feed-in law, you have seen that, so I skipped that. I call it always the mother of all renewable energy investments. And we come up with a concept for Japan. This is, of course, indicative. The feed-in tariffs are much lower than what you discuss here right now. I know that the startup cost would be probably more, but in the long run, I assume that with good policy measures, Japan and Germany would have more or less the same costs for renewables, and that would be sort of the detailed cost and input and output parameters for all the different renewable energy technologies. And we very much support the feed-in tariff concept, because you have different tariffs for different technologies. And we need a mix of different technologies. I do not want to have a competition in between solar and wind, or solar against wind, or wind and solar against biomass. We need the entire mix of all the different sources in order to actually implement a concept. And every technology needs to fulfill its own sustainability criteria, which means we cannot just use the entire technical concept. We need to have a sustainable potential. And therefore, we need to have technology-specific tariffs in order to avoid the one-size-fits-all policy, where it says, okay, the cheapest will win. That will basically put the pressure on one specific technology, maybe even on one specific job, a region, for example, a very windy region. So you will have the entire wind development on only one spot in the country, but not in the other one. That is negative on two aspects. One is that the acceptance on the local level, and we have heard the presentation from Samsung very well, and I grew up not very far from Samsung, but sort of on the other country, further southwest. We have a lot of wind development, but the acceptance is high because the farmers mostly own those wind farms. So we need to have distribution. And it's a good investment to pay maybe ½ more for a wind turbine on a not so good place than having everything on the best windy spot. The feed-in payments would basically, that's sort of the entire amount, and I skipped that. And I just wanted to show, we have a feed-in tariff, and compared to the current market price, it's in this calculation a bit higher, but if I see the development of the wind, especially of the PV prices, this green line will probably almost exactly on the conventional line, maybe even below. And then after the feed-in tariff is in place and paid, the costs are going down. But while because you have this generator and you don't need any additional fuel costs because they're paid, they're running, and they're operating for marginal cost, while on the conventional side you keep paying for fuel. And basically for an average household this wouldn't be much. In this calculation is around 3,000 yen. That's depending on where you have this beer I witnessed, it's about 3 to 5 beer a year. I think that's an affordable investment in the future for each household in order to come up with this. So I would like to conclude that in our energy evolution scenarios, we try to have a parameter for each audience, for each stakeholder. We have the technology pathway and the results, what kind of technologies we would like to see for the industry who is interested in technology development. We have employment parameters and the employment development for politicians because they like to create jobs. We have the investment parameters for the finance sector because they're really interested in the investment figures. And we have CO2 reduction targets or reduction pathways for ourselves, for the environmental community, because we do those energy scenarios and renewable energy policy because we would like to save the environment, save the climate, and a byproduct of that is actually a green economy with more jobs and sustainable economies in the long run. And this is where I close, and I think about 10 seconds over time. Sorry.
Sven, どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. So Sven and the Greenpeace, your expertise and such detailed explanation, and also that your focus for Japan. And there is a quick question. The green utility concept was introduced, and now that 90,000 customers they have, it's a real business. So in order to achieve such ambitious sort of target in 2020, the big business has to be integrated. So in that sense, the Greenpeace or other NGOs actually taking the sort of the future-oriented viewpoint and to take forward, and so that the big or the proper business will come in and integrate it in this trend. Could you share with us?
Yeah, Greenpeace Energy is actually a cooperative. It is not owned by Greenpeace, it's owned by their customers. And Greenpeace is basically just providing the name as a quality brand. So we say, by calling it Greenpeace Energy, it says that it fulfills the criteria, the environmental criteria of a green utility from Greenpeace. But it's owned by the customers. It's a cooperative. It's basically a classical community model. We would like to show this kind of concepts in practice, in reality. It's not, the target is not to take over the electricity or the power sector. It's just like to have an innovative company in the business in order to inspire others to follow.
どうもありがとうございました。では最後になりましたけど。
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Yamagishi Mr. Yamagishi. And WWF is, has the support of 5 million throughout the world, and the 55.4 billion yen is the annual budget. And it's a very big organization. Mr. Yamagishi is a leader of climate change and energy group. Thank you very much for the introduction. WWF Japan, the energy scenario for Japan is what I would like to talk and contribute to our discussion. I'm going to finish in 10 minutes, so please be awake. Please awake. Let me just briefly talk about this, and there are two like this. One is the energy conservation, and also the energy like renewable energies, and I'd like to talk about that later. So this scenario was made and supported by the Professor Tsuchiya, Haruki Tsuchiya. And as I said, is the supply side and demand side. There are two discussions, and two scenarios are made in parallel. The purpose is, in Japan, 100% renewable energy, not only electricity, but all other renewable energies inclusive. So whether it is, we try to visualize the 100% renewable energy option in Japan. Basically, our basic concept is very simple. As you can see in this graph, and the top line is, if you use like business as usual, that is what is going to happen. So how much reduction in energy is possible? And that's the first thing. Then phasing out nuclear power plants is estimated, and the remaining balance, how that can be supported by the supply of renewable energies. And I may talk a little bit more in details. So if I go straight into the conclusion, the energy conservation or energy consumption reduction, and the final conclusion is by 2050. So say that as of 2008 as a base, we have to halve the energy consumption, and it is possible. That is the outcome of this scenario. That's feasible. So what are the prerequisites for the scenario? What are the measures thought about? That is indicated in this table. So I don't have time, so I can just sort of illustrate two important points. One is, when we talk about the energy sort of reduction, they say we have only the situation of the dried towel. We don't have any more drop that we can reduce. But that's not the case. Of course, we had 1970s, we had oil shock, and that really sort of dramatically increased the efficiency of energy consumption. But after 1990, the efficiency hasn't improved. But other countries actually caught up with the Japanese situation, and that's the first point. The second point is, when you look into the different fields, there are areas that Japan is not the top runner. For example, like construction materials and housing and household insulation, and the standard of insulation of the housing and housing itself. And this efficiency is not very good and very lagged behind from the Europe. The most advanced standard in Japan, so-called standard in Japan, where even if we apply that, we can actually reduce by 36% of the consumption of energy. That is related to another very important point. In Japan, the most advanced efficiency standard is lagged far behind from EU. So we are not talking about something it's very ambitious. I think we are already lagged behind from EU. So even with like using their standard, we can reduce the consumption so much. So now that the renewables, and here in Japan, as I say, energy consumption to be halved. And that is the scenario based on that. Then electricity, other fuels were so decomposed into two. If you look at this, as somebody else actually presented in his paper, the electricity accounts for the 3/4 of energy for Japan. So when we say the 100% energy, electricity is talking about, but what to do with energy from non-electricity power? Talking about the energy from the electric power, various institutes and the Environment Ministry has been issued such data. And WWF is the nature conservation is our concept. So if you look at this, and what I would like you to pay attention is the feasible, realistically feasible potential for the PV and wind. What can be used. So they are not fully used, as you can see from, but even if you are not fully using, but you can still fulfill the demand of electricity. So how to fulfill the electricity demand? And that is this chart. And another chart, that is the demand of electricity. As I said earlier, non-electricity, actually sort of the fuel need has to be supplied, and it is quite difficult. So in WWF scenario, heat or other fuel needs can be translated into the electricity or hydrogen, and then to get the volume and to be supplied by renewable energy. This is the all-in-all renewable energies in the chart. This is the numbers. If you look at the year by year or the even decade, and you can see the energy. Well, the first one, energy efficiency. The second is the percentage of electricity and percentage of non-electricity at the bottom. The clearly stated 2020, year 2020, the former Prime Minister Khan was talking about, and by early 2020, the 20% should be achieved. And if you have to have the 30% in 2020 in order to get 100% in 2050. And electricity for fuel is included, and also non-electricity fuel. Another point, or the last point, is in 2050, electricity demand electricity is satisfy the demand of energy. They say renewables are fluctuating and cannot actually satisfy the daily needs of energy. That's the argument. But if you look at this, the 3 days of the May 23rd to 25th, and we have the simulation throughout the year, but I just took the 3 days as an example. If you look at this geothermal supplying the energy, and the peak is PV. When PV going down, then the hydro is going to become active. So, electricity demand of Japan, based on the climate, and this can be satisfied in 2050. And what became clear is, and backup capacity, backup electricity is necessary, is another argument against renewables. But we are also need what kind of backup capacity is necessary. If we can have the 900 gigawatt and basis, then we can actually satisfy that condition. And compatibility with the CO2 emission level in 2020. In order to achieve that, of course, that is a scenario. We need a lot of challenges to achieve that. One is whether we can have the target very clearly. Secondly, whether we can get the FIT design, fit design right. And the grid is completely integrated. Well, that's our assumption. And as I said earlier, heat and fuel, whether such demand respectively be met. So those are the findings that we had through our scenarios. Thank you very much.
山岸さんどうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Yamaguchi. That was very simple but very persuasive perspectives for the future. I have a question, if I may. A lot of information, including forecast, has been put forth, and the government and the industry would say one thing, and Yamaguchi-san and others would say another thing. Why is it that there is so much difference between these two parties? I think there are a lot of differences, but one thing is that the assumption is probably different. What are you looking for? For instance, 100% renewable energies scenario to be established. This was an idea that was first proposed at the WWF, and I had the hesitation, and I wondered whether that is at all possible. But within the context of a post-earthquake Japan, there is this concept that we have to change something. We have to establish a completely different energy system in this country, and that is the responsibility we have. And with that assumption, 100% renewables, which we never really conceived of in the past in the Japanese context, had become a possible reality. And in fact, we thought that this is our responsibility to look at this possibility and examine this further. And that is precisely the reason we have decided to look at this possible potential scenario. So if we just try to continue on the extension line of the existing system, that is one way of looking at it, and the other is to try to conceive of something completely different. I think that is the difference between the two parties. Right, thank you very much, Mr. Yamagishi. Sven and Eric, I have a question. From your positions, looking at the society and the people in general, you have to provide a lot of information, and I think it's very important you do that, because in general, the general people tend to be given a very small fragment of the entire set of picture. And people usually have a asymmetrical availability of information, and from the perspective of people, you need to provide information from a more position that would allow symmetrical sharing of information, so that the people will be given more information, more extensive information. And I think it's very paramount as we try to promote renewable into the future. Do you have any ideas or comments about how you should go about this?
I think in terms of the information, first the first step is information, and then inspire people with that. And and basically try to inspire also local communities to come up with local projects, and those local communities can then help to bring sort of nationwide, countrywide policy in place. So it's basically, it's an interaction between NGOs, communities, and the government. I think that's a very fruitful debate. And I would like to also stress the fact that it's getting, on one side, a lot easier also for us, because we cannot only say that the industry has already developed the technology. It's there and it's reliable, and that wasn't the case when I started working on it as an engineer in the mid-90s. For example, inverters were not really reliable for photovoltaics, but now they are really reliable. So we have the good point that the technology is there, but also we have the situation that it is not expensive. It is not more expensive. In many cases, it's actually cheaper. And I would like to stress the feed-in law. Not the important part of the tariff is basically the main thing. It must be a fair tariff, but not extremely high. The more important thing on feed-in tariffs is that you actually get a guaranteed access to the grid and deliver and guarantee dispatch. Because in the future, I see less problems of implementing renewables in new markets, and I see more and more problems when renewables actually do what utilities have told us over many decades that they can't do. They can actually deliver. And then there is not enough room in the grid. And then the conventional power sources need to go down. And then we have a real commercial fight. And I think this is a situation ahead of us, which, again, we need to sort of manage with policy. So I think my message is our role as an NGO in this whole market is to try to provide a very neutral technology assessment for renewables and sort of distributing information about good and best practice policies, as well as policy which might not work.
Well, I have two answers to your question. First, I think we should recognize that a lot of the information that the public is receiving is coming from major energy companies, utilities, oil companies. Those are the ones that the media listens to, and they have big names and a lot of reputation, and yet they're providing information that's in their interest. And they're threatened by these transformations that are coming, these huge changes that renewables potentially can bring. And they don't want to see this happen too quickly, at least. And so I think there needs to be alternative sources which are equally as credible and equally listened to compared to that. And I think that's really our job. The second answer I have for you is that, I think the Japanese public, I think most people here don't realize that Japan is very far behind the rest of the world now in terms of renewable energy. I mean, I'm very sorry to say that, but Japan used to be a real leader in renewable energy in the 1990s with solar PV and solar hot water. It was in the top in the world, and it's lost that leadership in the last 10 years. And other countries in Europe, the US, even developing countries now, China in particular, are so far ahead of where Japan is in terms, you just look at the statistics objectively in terms of, per person and in terms of economy, how much renewable energy is being developed here. And I think if people realize that the world is so far ahead of Japan now, that kind of information, that kind of perspective could lead, push for the changes that are required here. And I really think, and I live here in Tokyo myself, and I really think that Japan can lead the world again in renewable energy. And I think that it's really important for Japan to do that. I think the way the world will go in the future depends on what happens here in these coming years. This is really a historic period, and I really hope we see changes happen here.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
時間が過ぎ
So although we are a little behind time, maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. So please.
できましたらお名前ご承
And then please indicate your name and organization.
Thank you. About Resources Institute. I had a question that I wanted to pass on to the panel that I get a lot in the countries I work in with this, which is mainly the United States, but also a number of developing countries, which is where does the equipment come from? It's related a bit to the job benefits, a bit related to Eric's point about Japan becoming a leader again. And I could imagine that it could become an important question in Japan as well. So the question is, where do you see different economies, different countries going in terms of who manufactures the solar panels or the wind turbines? And what would be the impacts of jobs? And particularly because we're in Japan here, which parts of the industry can Japan lead in again? Because obviously there's also big advantages of sourcing some of these equipments, for example, from China, if that means they can be much cheaper and therefore you can build more projects and you can have more jobs in installation and so on. So I think it's an interesting trade-off, particularly for developed countries to see in which innovative parts of the value chain you could still lead or play an active role, and which ones you just buy somewhere else.
Sven, do you have anything to answer to this question?
Yeah, I think there is, of course, a race, and I'm working for an international organization, which means I'm not sort of recommending this country or this country, but I live in Germany most of the time, and we're just witnessing sort of a very practical competition in terms of the German PV manufacturers versus the Chinese ones. And I see, of course, it's pretty tough competition, but the competition basically accelerates the efficiency. So German developer try to basically compete with more quality and more innovation, and not with mass production, because they know that they can't win this. So it will basically, it's actually a very fruitful, even though pretty hard competition. I see that also that in terms of job implication, if we remain at the PV as a technology, per megawatt you create about 10 to 15 jobs for new installations. Only one of that is manufacturing, and the rest is installation, operation and maintenance, the finance service, and all those other different things. So even if the panel will not come from your country, maybe the inverter comes from your country, but specifically the mounting system will come from your country. Local people will actually install it, operate it, so that will remain in the country. Wind is actually even better because the wind turbines are so big that once there is a fairly good market, it actually makes sense to produce the blades right at the spot, or close to the spot at least. So I think there is an international competition, but everybody has his role to play. And there will be a few production hubs, which we also need because we need economies of scale, which means if it's too fractioned, then we won't get down with the prices. So we have a diverse picture, but at the end of the day, overall, the job effects are always positive, even if not everything is manufactured right on the spot.
Eric?
Obviously Japan is not going to be able to compete with China in manufacturing PV panels and wind turbines. But I think where Japan really can compete and do well is in the integration side that I mentioned in my talk, in terms of integrating renewables with power systems, with transport, with electric vehicles. Japan is leading the world in electric vehicle manufacturing and technology. And how that gets integrated with renewables, we talk about smart grids, and we talk about integration in the household side. And the cost of solar panels themselves, solar cells, are becoming so small that really it's the balance of the rest of the system that is costing a lot. And there you can have, again, this sort of integration and expertise with system integration and reducing overall system costs. The Chinese are actually not very good at system thinking, at integration in that way yet, at least. And that, I think, is a true advantage here in Japan.
はい、ありがとうございました。今のご質問と2人
Thank you very much. having listened to your question and the answers, this is not the argument related to renewables, and I think this is expanding to the whole of the economy. How do we cooperate? How do we compete with the other countries around the world? And I think there's an overlap with that global question. Perhaps we can take just one more question, please.
Okay, I'm Lena Lindahl from Sustainable Sweden Association, and a question to Eric. I'm also thinking about the consumers in Japan, those 80% waiting to be free from nuclear power. And they wait for this market, but the only choice now as a consumer is basically to consume less and save energy. Do you have any other idea of what the consumers should do or could do, or where they should put their efforts, sort of?
Well, solar hot water is practical and cost effective. Here in Japan, I think a lot more could be done at a household level. Solar hot water, certainly solar PV now has become cheap enough. Most people don't realize how much the cost has come down in the last 2 years. And if you look at Japan where Japan is leading right now is at the local level. City governments, local municipal governments are doing a lot to promote things, and you have citizen groups and you have people, investing in renewable facilities collectively on a community scale, on an individual citizen scale. And I think that those trends here are actually pointing the rest of the world to those types of solutions as well. We had a community power conference here yesterday, and a lot of that was discussed, and I think that that there are a lot of things that are happening now, and that households and groups of individuals are doing here.
予定の時間を10分ほど超過します。
See, so we have exceeded by 10 minutes the time, but thank you very much for your enthusiastic participation in the discussion. So please indicate your gratitude to the three speakers with a warm round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much for staying with us until the very end of the day.
以上をもちまして本日のすべてのプログラムは終了となります。引き続きホワイエにて交流のレセプションを実施いたします。お時間のあります方はどうぞご参加ください。本日はご参加いただき誠にありがとうございました。This concludes today's program. Following today's final session, the light reception will be held